Hi, welcome to day 20 of 24 in 24, our initiative, 929 initiative, as we're counting up through the 24 books of Tanakh. We're almost there, so if you've been following along, thank you for learning along with us. I'm Shira Hecht-Kohler, the Director of Education for 929 English, and honored to be learning together tonight again with Ruby Namdar, novelist, teacher, scholar, friend of 929, and we're very grateful to be learning together, to have you, Ruby, as we explore the book of Kohelet.
Wonderful to be back. Thank you.
So let's start with picking up where we left off a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
For those of you that haven't been following along or will be following along at a later point, just about 3 weeks ago, Ruby and I sat down and we learned and explored themes in the book of Leviticus and Sefer Vayikra. And right now it feels like it was, an alternate reality. We were in a little bit of a different place in terms of the events of the world. And we were talking about notions of purity and impurity in the moment that we are in. And in the ensuing 3 weeks, it feels like we have just sped out of control and the world unraveled into a new reality. The practicalities, everyone kind of quickly learned how to disinfect, how to use Zoom, how to homeschool children. And then the bigger dimensions of this crisis moment that we are in set in, and the enormity of it set in. And so I think now, as we 3 weeks later are sitting down with a little bit of a different headspace, learning the book of Kohelet, I wonder, how can this book actually frame this experience for us as it's unfolding right now? We'll jump in with that framing question and then backtrack.
So before we go to Kohelet, which is a book that's associated, of course, with Pesach, but it's really a strange association. I would like to speak for a minute about Pesach that is coming this week. Yes, a week from today, Leila Seder.
Well, as we're recording, so a week from now we're recording, but for the world, it's just in a couple of days.
How biblical these times feel, and how, when I think about this year's Seder, it's going to be in many ways closer to the original Seder Mitzrayim, the first night in Egypt, the night before going to freedom, where our ancestors sat closed in their homes, protected by a very thin layer of blood, film of blood on the door seal. And the force of destruction was outside, wreaking havoc in the world. And everybody was gathered in their small space in a great sense of uncertainty, and at the same time, a sense of joy and anticipation. I don't know how much joy and anticipation we are feeling this year, but there is a vitality in us and there is a hope. And I think that we will prevail this one too. So this is before we go into Kohelet.
Amen.
Amen. So, cheers, by the way. Chaim. What are you drinking? Cab?
Shiraz.
Shiraz. My mother was born in Shiraz.
This is for our memory.
Exactly, the Chaim. So Kohelet is a perfect book for times like this. It's a perfect book for any time. But Kohelet is a perfect book. Had I not been a traditionalist, had I been into innovation as a way of life all the time, I would say that we should cancel all the Torah readings on Yom Kippur and just read Kohelet. It is the best book for introspection.
It's sobering.
Yes, it's sobering, and it is also a book of extreme honesty with oneself, a book of taking stock, and a book of liberating yourself from all the misconceptions that you lived with all your life. And in that way, it's a perfect book for Pesach as well. People, I'm older and more forgiving now, but when I was younger and more arrogant, I would judge people by what they say about Kohelet. Anyone who would say, oh, it's so depressing, I would give up on them. I would be like, ugh, you're depressing. I don't find the book depressing at all. On the contrary, the book is liberating, but it has to be read as such.
Okay, what are some of the dimensions that you find
Exactly.
liberating in particular?
So, the book of Kohelet, and we will reach that point where I might say that it's the books of Kohelet. I have my unbased creative assumption as of the origins of this book. The book of Kohelet is, first of all, a book written, attributed to an old man. Okay? Somebody who was already taking stock of his life way past his prime and out of the grip of the passions and forces that drive us in our youth. In that way, it's a very liberating book because it is a book, in some way, everybody likes to be a Buddhist nowadays. You know, it's very, very fashionable to be nobody knows what Buddhism is, but everybody fancies themselves a Buddhist, especially the Jews nowadays. But in that way, it really almost touches Buddhism in the way that it's the book of letting go, standing outside of the human hustle bustle of the human endeavor, looking at it from the outside and liberating yourself from it. If you think about it in this way, it is the ultimate book of liberation. You're liberated from passion, from hope, but also from disappointment and despair. Right?
And at odds, like, I guess that also speaks in many ways to the structure of the book, right? Like, if you try to create some sort of literary framework or, you know, this is a book that it's not methodical. It is not the result of an organized thinker. There's a lot of tension. No. It repeats itself. It contradicts itself. It's not systematic. There's irregularity all throughout. And so if you were trying to say, you know, what's the structure or what is the author trying to intend, that actual like tension and irregularity pushes, you know, it pushes it to make it a more animated book. Like, that gives it its charm.
So this is, I love that. And I love the many contradictions. And I love the fact that there is no method. There is no message to Kohelet. If you think there's a message to Kohelet, you haven't read the book. You heard about the book. You haven't read the book. So let's then go back and ask you, Shira, a scholar in your own right, and a good one too. Why do you think there's all these tensions and irregularities and redundance? And what is your wild assumption as of this book? Why is it so wild and not systematic and repetitious and contradictory? Why?
Yeah, there is that feeling of a manic energy to it, right? Like
I love that.
There's moments that have meditative qualities that actually, like, the, you know, forced repetition, and we'll look at some of those chapters in detail, but reflections on time that flow in a way that feels very meditative. And then the next chapter or the next segment will say, okay, but nothing matters. Actually, hakol havel, everything is just havel. It's nonsensical, and it flips back and forth. So therefore, I will indulge in luxury, in wine, in the pleasures of life. But actually, no, man comes from the earth and he'll return. And there is this sense of, you know, that sort of.
What is your wildest assumption about this book then? I mean, how come so many contradictions?
Well, it's collected.
Yes.
In many ways, it's diary entries woven together. It's notes and sticky notes that are stuck on the walls. I think, you know, when I think about a craft and art, that's what it feels like.
Collected thoughts. And the book actually gives you a very open hint. Only we ignore it. We ignore it since the day of the sages. The book says, these are the words of Kohelet, king of Jerusalem. Was there a king in Jerusalem named Kohelet? There wasn't a king named Kohelet. The book tells you, but we refuse to listen because we love the idea that it's written by King Solomon, the wisest of all wise, who also, as we know, wrote the Song of Songs when he was young and passionate. And he wrote Mishlei when he was an annoying Jewish dad trying to warn his sons not to do everything that he did. One day we'll study Mishlei.
Got it.
It's the book of old sinners trying to tell the young not to do what they've done. And now he's old and he is reflecting on a life well lived and yet futile.
Yeah.
But
can I jump in just 1 second for those following? That actually is it's a midrash, right? There's a midrash in Shir HaShirim Rabbah, right? A collection of midrashim that states that Solomon wrote these 3 books, and actually Rabbi Yonatan is of the position that they were written at different stages in Solomon's life. So that's, it's one position, but it's interesting to reflect on why they would hold that he would have written these at the different stages as a youngster, as a middle-aged man, and as an old man reflecting on life and its bizarre inconsistencies. So just to ground it in that.
And also it's a beautiful position, and therefore we will absolutely believe in it because we will always believe in the most beautiful and alluring of possibilities. Because if we were scientific about the Tanakh, we would not have the relationship we have with it. And it doesn't matter really who wrote it and who did not. It matters, the mythology of it matters, of who our ancestors believe, who it was attributed. We walk into the book, but in Kohelet, a trap is set for us. But it's set in such plain sight that nobody sees it. There is no king named Kohelet. He's a literary construct. And the book says it, but nobody ever believes the book.
Well, I think the greatest evidence to try to sort of construct that is looking at the last 2 verses of the book, which, we're at the beginning and the middle, but I would flip to the end where, we almost have like an add-on. The book ends with this kind of like pious reflection. Sof davar hakol nishmat Elokim yirah v'et mitzvotav tishmor ki zeh kol adam. Right, the end of the matter. Everything's heard. Keep the commandments. It seems really at odds with the cynicism and the skepticism and everything else that you have in the rest of the book. So that is this kind of an attachment, an add-on afterwards, another voice. How can we kind of reconcile that with everything that we've seen beforehand?
I think if we relieve ourselves from the idea this book was authored by one author, which clearly it was not, now we have to assume and fantasize, and I think it's a wonderful fantasy game. How was this amazing? I just want to say, first of all, to me, Kohelet is a great cultural and literary asset of humanity. Forget us, forget the Jews, forget the Torah. It's a highlight of all human civilization. It's incredible.
Can you point to 1 or 2?
I will, but I will with great pleasure. And I would love to go to my favorite places there. So this is it. I think we have an amazing gem. And at the same time, we have a very mysterious composition that doesn't behave like one composition. My answer is it's because it's not one composition. They took the editors of this amazing collection of poems, took a theme, an imaginary king named Kohelet. By the way, the name Kohelet, Maza Kohelet in Hebrew, to gather, that's a hint. The king, actually, he's a collective. This is a collection of kings of poetry, the great philosophers of a time. Or it might not even be of one time. It might have been the last three centuries. The best poems written to that theme. Had you been King Solomon or the wise philosopher king at the end of your life, You have 500 words or so, whatever, like in our terms, to summarize in the most beautiful, poetic, searing, memorable way the human condition. And this is Kohelet, a collection of wonderful prose poems that were not written by the same person, because there's not only ideological and theological huge differences between the different chapters, but style. Some of them don't even address the same question.
Yeah.
It is not a book. It is a collection. It's an anthology. And the name actually gives in the secret, but we refuse to see it. Each one of these poets takes like a jazz, think of it as a jazz session. Each of the poets takes the theme and he riffs off of it in his wonderful way.
So let's think about how that plays out, because we have some themes that do follow from beginning to end. So for example, we'll take the word hevel, right? Which in lots of different sections can be translated actually in different ways, but it is a central motif of the book. It can be translated as, vanity, nothingness, senselessness, frustration, vapor, air, wind, futility. I mean, there's all different ways, and depending on the context, and scholars have kind of worked through different chapters the way it appears. But that ends up being, right, this central motif of the book, right? That's the worldview through which the narrative, the mythology is collected and framed, right? Everything is futile. Hakol havel roads, it doesn't matter. It's just pursuit of wind. So that's something that, even if we argue and we say that this is collection, different people, different times, different styles, that is a driving motif throughout the entire book.
Look, it could be, now that we're free to imagine, that the first chapter, which usually is the case, the first chapter is the original chapter, written by King Solomon. There's no reason to assume. Or by someone who's, the original Baal Kohelet. And then the rest are riffing off of the first chapter. It could very well be. And again, given that many of the chapters do go back to the original theme, but some do not. And don't forget, these chapters are late. These chapters are actually Christian division. So I don't know how the original division was. It might have been more.
Very different.
We know for sure that at least the famous chapter 9 and some of them.
7, 9 flip. They're inconsistent in the middle. They kind of go back.
And we actually, if we had like a semester to parse it, one could sit and parse the different poems, and we'll probably come back with 30 different poets or 10 different poets and like 30 different takes on the theme. But when I want to go back to the idea of liberation and connect it to hevel, to vapor or nothing or vanity. First of all, in Hebrew, when we say havel avalim, it just means nonsense.
Right.
Shtuyot, hevel, hevel uruach, nonsense, norishkeit, stam. It's ruder than vanities. It's more rude than that. It's more dismissive. This is not a polite book. Now, when somebody who is considered to be the wisest philosopher king, and definitely speaks with great authority, I mean, the persona, not the person, the persona that's the narrator is the man who amassed everything in the world, including knowledge. So he's not stupid, he's not ignorant. Kohelet has a Zen quality, not Zen as in the fake, people sitting with Asian music pretending they're Asian. Zen in the true sense of the word, that they slap your intellectual arrogance out of you and say, schmuck, you know nothing. And then your liberation begins. But then your liberation begins. It is a book that's made to unshackle you from your ego and from the illusion that you actually know and have control over the world through knowledge. Now, what better time is there than the days where we're all hunkering down in our homes, you know, drinking our last bottles of wine and like not knowing what is going on,
Yeah.
than to be disillusioned from our arrogance of thinking we have tamed nature, we have tamed creation, we know everything. Everything in our domain. We have dominion over nature. And look at us now.
I think, you know, when we think about Hevel, like the persona of the biblical Hevel, and the sense of like he was insignificant in a way. It wasn't that he was nothing, like Cain, meaning Kinyan, he was an innovator, creative, he was the first person to conceive of farming, and Hevel was relative to that was insignificant because there was a sense that he didn't do anything productive. And in so many ways, I think when we think about now and the moment we're in, and arrogance and ego, and, you know, to what extent can our kind of egos fly away, that that personality also comes to play in this book in a literary.
You know, it's an interesting thing. I mean, whether there is a connection, a direct connection or not to the Hevel of Genesis, it's a very good question. It's definitely a very good midrash.
Right. I'm not sure there is, but right. Like the sense that it should evoke a little bit of where do we see other
someone, you know, when you say, you know, in English, when the idiom smoke and mirrors, Hevel, smoke too. You know, there's something about, or a smoke in your eyes, you know, or when the smoke clears, something that doesn't let you see. Again, I'm going back to Buddhism, a culture I know very little about, but like, you know, the whole idea of Maya, of like the illusion of existence, Kohelet also slaps you out of it too. There is no valid knowledge. Now, by the way, that's a very timely theme in our intellectual life today. You know, we in the past few decades have been undoing all the structures of validation, of intellectual validation, right? Of epistemological validity. This Kohelet does it for us many thousands of years ago. Okay? But again, I want to go back to the point of liberation, because who does this idea depress? The person who is in love with the ego, the person for whom it is essential to feel that they own the world and they know everything. For other people, the more, in my opinion, the philosophical type, there is a great relief in this saying you don't know anything. You know everything and you know nothing. Do you know the wonderful medieval Persian poet Omar Khayyam? Translated to the English by Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald's translation became a like cornerstone of like modern English poetry. It's wonderful. And I read them in the original Persian. And again, the same kind of message. Again, I'm a mathematician, astronomer, a very serious intellectual figure by day, and a desperate hedonistic poet by night. This was Khayyam. Now think about taking this tension of the philosopher king, who at the same time tells you that all knowledge is bullshit. That's a very potent positioning. And again, I repeat it because I'm going to say it a lot tonight, because I feel like it's not said enough. A very liberating position. Because if you're going to pursue knowledge from now on, you're going to do it from a place of irony, doubt. You're going to do it in the Jewish way. You know, you can know everything and you can know nothing.
I don't focus on the liberating aspect of Kohelet, right? People think of Kohelet, they think of doom, they think of destruction, they think of nothing matters, but there is this sense of freeing yourself from constructs. And I wonder, you know, I actually want to just share the screen, and we'll look at maybe just chapter 3, very famous chapter about time, because I think one of the sort of chokeholds that we experience is that of time. And right now we're actually in a time where it feels kind of timeless. There's a timelessness. There's days
Yeah.
bleeding into one another. There's hours. What day is it? I don't know. And there's something
Yeah.
difficult about that, but also something very liberating. So maybe, you know what, I'll put it up on the screen
Let's
for
do
1 second for everyone.
Let's do it.
Here we go. Oh, that's 3. We'll go to the beginning of, just to read, right, talk about this being a famous book in terms of humanity. So this chapter, I think, was probably popularized by Pete Seeger and the Birds. But for us, when we think about time, right, lakol zman, ve'et lakol chefetz tachat hashamayim. There's a season that's set for everything.
It's wonderful, right?
Time for being born and dying, for planting, for uprooting, for slaying and healing, for tearing down and building up. Et lifkot ve'et lischok, et tzvor ve'et rakod, a time for weeping, a time for laughing, a time for wailing, a time for dancing. Et lahashlich avanim ve'et knos avanim, et lachabok ve'et lurchok mechabek. A time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones. A time for embracing and a time for shunning embraces. Et levakesh ve'et la'abed, et lishmor ve'et lashlich. A time for seeking, a time for losing, a time for keeping, a time for discarding. Et lekra ve'et litzpor, et lechashot ve'et ledaber, et le'ahov ve'et lisno, et mechama ve'et shalom. A time for ripping, a time for sowing, a time for silence, a time for speaking, a time for loving, a time for hating, a time for war, a time for peace. I think we were running through this because we don't have the semester, but this evokes this sense of there is a set time, but actually also we experience that sometimes you kind of don't know what those times are. And
I don't know if it's such a good question. First of all, I want to say something about the famous song. I think this, like every poetry that's put to music, there are pros and cons. There's advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of it is that people know it. People know every time, you put a poem to music, you make a song out of a poem, and it's remembered, often more than those that were not. I come from Israel, where there's a big trend of composing shirei meshorerim, poetry, not just songwriting. It's a long and beloved tradition in Israel, for example. And there's a question whether the music takes over. Does the music become the poem and nobody actually reads the poem anymore? I think it's fine. I think that the music preserves it, gives it a life, and then we come back and reread it, and it sometimes seems different than the song. So let's talk about the song for a minute. The song is like what, the 60s?
Yeah, well, I think Pete Seeger wrote the lyrics in the 50s and the Birds popularized it in 65. But yeah.
So it's like an anthem of the 60s and hippies.
And war and a time for love and peace. And I think it took on those resonances. And when you think about the song in cultural history, it's that, that placement, not the time for all the other things, but the time for love and peace and ignore the time for war and uprooting. So I think it's kind of not fair.
So that's exactly my point. My point is that the song turned this into a hippie anthem, which is fine, as long as they're hippies, they need their anthems. And it's a beautiful song. It's very kind of, mesmerizing you. It's sweeping. There's something about the song itself that's just so beautiful, right? And the beauty of the lyrics is immense. But the singing of it with those sweet voices and the hippies and the youth and the hope, the kind of vapid hope of it, take the edge off the actual poem. So I want us to take a minute and forget Pete Seeger and the song for a minute. And let's look at what the poem actually tells us.
I'm going to put it back up, actually, for everyone to see. Hang on.
On its face, this is a tautological poem. I wouldn't say it's banal because it's so beautiful, but what's the big chiddush here? What's the big renovation? We all know that there's war and peace. There's love and a hate. Sometimes you destroy, sometimes you build. Sometimes you give birth and sometimes you kill. Sometimes you live, sometimes you die. Actually, what did you say by that? Nothing, if you think about it. On its face, it says nothing. That's why the hippies liked it so much. It sounds beautiful and it says nothing. But thank God, these days are over. The 60s are over. Now it's like we're in Corona time. Now it's time to tackle reality.
Need some other
This is the least banal book in the world. There's nothing banal about Kohelet. There's not a banal second in Kohelet. Zipper, stop. The doggy is barking. No, you went out. Come. Sorry. There's nothing banal about Kohelet. It's not a book of kitsch. There's nothing about this book that, empty. So what
are some of the takeaways? Let's because
what is the
close
point
up with some of that. Like, what is advice that Kohelet has to offer? What are takeaways that a reader of this book, 12 chapters, it's pretty long, and we read it on Sukkot, and it's a long read.
Let's stick with this point 1 minute before we go to the takeaway of the whole book. There isn't a takeaway. Let me put your mind at ease. There is no takeaway from Kohelet. There are takes-aways. There is no takeaway. If you think there's a takeaway, you haven't listened to what I said until now. There is no. Let's focus on this poem. This poem, apart from stating the obvious that there's war and peace in the world, what does it actually tell you? What do you think? Okay, so we all know there's war and peace, and sometimes we die and sometimes we live. Where's the chidush? When does this become interesting?
That we don't actually know what the time for these things are. I think that's the only point of this that gives you an edge, that creates uncertainty, right? That there are time constructs, yes, that's true. But the fact that we have no clue, right? Exactly. I would have said right now, and when we look at which pasuk is it?
Yes.
Right? Yep. This is a moment where we think about embrace, and you might say to yourself, oh, this is actually should be a time for embrace, but actually it's a time for shunning embraces. Yeah. And everything is kind of turned upside on its head. So you don't actually know what the time for something.
Yeah, that's a very, very, thank you. That's a very good midrash. And you know what? That's the problem with the fake harmony that the music of that beautiful song imposes on these lyrics. There's everything but harmony here. It's harmony, but it's the harmony of somebody who's outside of existence. When you're in existence, there's never a good time to die. There's never a good time to lose everything you have. There's never a good time to lose your loved ones. You always want things to work your way. This is called being human. Actually, it's very radical to go outside of existence, sit in this like stoic or again, Buddhist almost position, detached from the human condition, detached of your humanness, liberated, seeing this and saying, there is a time, but when you're in the game, you never know it.
You know when it is.
You never know when the right time is, and you never know if things really work, if this is what's supposed to be. When you're in existence, you always want it to work your way. When you are removed from it, like the old king waiting to die, sitting outside of the city, waiting to die, reflecting, that's the only time where these words have power. And also, it tells you that there are times to have war. There's time to be angry. There's time to hate. Time to die. Time to destroy. That it is part of creation. That's very radical. That's part of existence. Destroy our destructive forces, our hatred, our not wanting to embrace the other, the stranger, the minorities. It's all part of the human condition. I don't think Pete Seeger would like it so much, right? If he
Sorry?
actually read the words.
Who wouldn't? I didn't hear what he said.
Excuse me?
I just didn't hear what you said. Who wouldn't like it so much?
I don't think Pete Seeger and the,
Oh.
and the Dreamboats or whatever
And
they
the
were called
birds,
would like
no.
it so much, would they?
Who knows? Oh, wow. Okay, I
A
think
book with an edge. There's a
yeah,
lot of edge in
we need a
Kohelet. It's a
version. We'll
book
do
for
a
people who
cover.
like
I
edge.
think we've got to do a cover that has a bit more of an edge on this song than
Yeah,
that
yeah.
happy, light,
Not
soft
happy and no light.
car in the Berkshires. It's got to have a little bit of a okay, we have about 2 minutes left. So I guess there's so many themes that we haven't explored, pleasure being one of them. I mean, I think there's so many takeaways, or not one, but just kind of each chapter has its own flavor, or even several flavors in that one chapter. But
If I was to summarize.
not summarize, but kind of a closing point,
Okay.
particularly now where we are at, approaching Pesach, in the moment that we're in, that for
Okay.
us.
Having told you quite obnoxiously that there is no takeaway, I will now tell you what if I had a takeaway, it's a complex takeaway. It's not one point. But the takeaway is to, at the same time, believe and be skeptical. Embrace reality, success, ambition, lust, love, piety. At the same time, remain suspicious of them. Okay? Translate my pursuit of wisdom also into finding harmony. He says things that are very radical. He says, marry out of love. Marry out of love. Life is too short. Make sure you're always dressed right. Make sure you have nice oil in your hair. Live it up. This is all there is. He tells you that now, life is now. Don't look for an afterlife. That's a waste of life. Very radical. You know, by the way, that this book, there was dispute whether it enters the Tanakh or not. Thank God that the rabbis of then are much, much
more open-minded and liberal, right?
cooler than the rabbis that came later. Because
they enjoyed the pleasures of life. They needed to have a sense.
And at the same time, sof davar hakol nishma. And at the same time, everything will be accounted for. Live it up, but also be mindful and responsible.
And skeptical, as you said.
And skeptical and ironic. Know everything, but know that you know nothing. Want everything, but know that nothing will be enough. Enjoy, seek pleasure, but be aware that pleasure eventually is an empty thing. Being able to hold these two contradicting truths is what, for me, is the essence of Jewish culture. Being able to say yes and yes. I'm faithful and I'm ironic. I am serious, but I'm joking. I am pious, but I'm irreverent. Yes, I am. I'm both. That's why I find the book of Kohelet to be such a treasure, because it hands you in the most beautiful, complex, sophisticated way the tools to become a complex, sophisticated person. And what better gift can we get than that?
Amazing. Thank you. Holding the tensions. I think it creates a fire in your belly when you have to hold the tensions, but that's what Tanakh is about. That's what Jewish literature is about. That's what life is about. So we're very, very grateful, Ruby, again for this conversation. We have a few more days of completing all of Tanakh, and we hope that everyone will join us on our Siyum on Wednesday, April 8th at 8:30 in the morning. We'll have a Siyum of 24 and 24 of this initiative, and everyone should be safe and well and healthy and learning together with us. We hope it brings some sustenance to everyone wherever you are. So Ruby, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sameach.
Pesach, and let's hope for much better days ahead.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you. Bye bye.